Wednesday morning, but just not quite as readily as we've seen of late. But as we go through the rest of the week, it will remain settled with those temperatures still reaching the low 20s.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
The Dewbs Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate. Both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It is 6 p.m. Good evening. This is Dewbs Co with me, Emily Carver. I'm standing in for Michelle Dewberry on this bank holiday Monday evening. So, the Philip Schofield ITV saga continues to rumble on. We've had contradictory statements released. We've had ITV presenters and colleagues scrambling to save their own reputations, advertisers pulling the plug on the show. There are even reports that Philip Schofield's photo has been removed from the ITV studios. So, what does this all mean for the future of This Morning and for ITV as a whole? Then it seems we've got concrete evidence that record immigration is driving up rents across Britain. Who would have thought that'd be the case if only we had a government with a mandate to reduce immigration? And I'm ever so slightly concerned that Labour seem to be taking their manifesto ideas from eco-zealots Just Stop Oil. They're pledging what Just Stop Oil is asking, a ban on all new North Sea oil and gas. So is Labour in the grips of the country's most extreme climate protesters? And over on the blue side, has the Conservative Party lost its mind at the same time? Retailers have come out in unison to slam the idea of asking supermarkets to cap their own prices. What does this say about the government? And lastly, the Met Police will only attend mental health related 999 calls if there is an immediate threat to life. Is this a total dereliction of duty? All of that to come tonight on Dewbs Co with me, Emily Carver. But first, let's get the latest news headlines.
Emily, thank you. I'm Bethany Elsey with your top stories from the GB newsroom at 6 p.m. ITV is in crisis talks following the scandals surrounding Philip Schofield's affair with a younger male colleague. The programme's main sponsor, the car dealer Arnold Clark, announced it won't review its contract this autumn, and GB News understands it could cost the broadcaster tens of millions of pounds in lost advertising revenue. Philip Schofield has rejected claims there was a toxic culture on this morning. In a statement released shortly before the show went to air this morning, he said it's the same handful of people with a grudge against me or the show who seem to have the loudest voice. Well, GB News presenter and former ITV This Morning host Eamon Holmes has hit back, saying Schofield has just put out a delusional statement. Like Holly, he posted it on Instagram stories, so if it goes wrong, there's no record after 24 hours. I'm reluctant to give the liar any more publicity, but believe me, if you're looking for a fight, you've picked the wrong person. In other news, 7 men have been remanded in custody, charged with the attempted murder of Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell in County Tyrone. Caldwell was shot several times at a sports centre in Omagh back in February. All 7 men will appear before Omagh Magistrates Court next month. 2 of them were also charged with being members of the IRA, and 3 of them with the preparation of terrorist acts. British police will help to crack down on people smuggling gangs in an attempt to stop migrants leaving North Africa. Officers from the National Crime Agency will work alongside authorities in Tunisia and Algeria. The Italian government predicts up to 400,000 people will try to reach Europe via the Mediterranean Sea this summer. That's 4 times as many as last year. The former Conservative advisor Claire Purcell says it's a good move.
It is completely correct that we start looking at where people are coming from, where the conflict zones are, and working with those countries to ensure that they don't come through to mainland Europe and make their way across and then into the Channel. And it takes an international community to stop these things, which is now what we're starting to see.
Concerns have been raised over the Metropolitan Police's plans to stop attending emergency mental health calls from September. The Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, says the move would give officers more time to focus on tackling crime, but that they will still respond if there was an immediate threat to life. The former Inspector of Constabulary, Zoe Billingham, warned the change could be dangerous, leading to a vacuum in care. The father of an aspiring Royal Marine who was killed by an asylum seeker has spoken exclusively to GB News. 21-year-old Tommy Roberts was fatally stabbed by Lawangeen Abdul Rahimzai while trying to stop a fight over an electric scooter in Bournemouth. The Afghan double murderer who entered the UK posing as a child was sentenced to life in prison. Tommy's father, Peter, told Dan Wootton it should never have been allowed to happen.
The fact he shouldn't have even been in the country anyway, do you feel let down by the system?
Very, very let down. No one checked him out. And even though the foster parent has insisted and given him lots of times, he'd been caught with a knife and she'd taken it away from him. But nothing was done with the social workers, with the immigration, with the police. No one actually asked the question, let's check this guy out. He seems really bad. There's a lot of bad reports about him. Let's just make the phone call and check him out.
You can watch that full interview on Dan Wootton tonight at 9 o'clock. Russia has launched rare daytime airstrikes on Ukraine's capital, the 16th air attack on Kyiv this month. School children were forced to take cover and one person has been taken to hospital, but no major damage has been reported. Ukraine's military says 11 missiles were intercepted, but emergency services had to clear the debris from roads. Today's barrage follows 2 nights of heavy drone strikes, with Ukraine indicating it will launch a counter-offensive imminently. And the Canadian city of Halifax has declared a state of emergency as wildfires continue to wreak havoc in the region. Dashcam footage shows a car speeding through flames and smoke, narrowly avoiding a collision with another vehicle. The fires have caused evacuations and power outages, and several schools have been shut down. Earlier this month, the western province of Alberta also declared a state of emergency after wildfires forced tens of thousands of people from their homes. You're up to date on TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now it's back to Emily.
Thank you, Bethany. Welcome to Dewbs Co with me, Emily Carver. I'm standing in for Michelle this evening. So joining me until 7 is my wonderful panel, Joe Phillips, political commentator, and also we've got Connor Tomlinson, who is a writer and podcast host. I don't think we've been on together in this particular show. I often stand in for Michelle when she's away, so this will be a nice new match for me. You've been on together.
Me and Connor. 2 weeks ago, we had quite a fiery duel.
Oh, well, let's have some more of that. And at home, do remember you can get in touch with us about everything we talk about this evening. GB Views at gbnews.com or on Twitter at GBNews. So before we crack on to the big political debates of the day, the big cultural stories that we're going to be discussing, we're going to stop for a second and get the response of my panel to what's been going on at ITV. Philip Schofield, ITV's This Morning, who knew what when, but what does this mean for the programme this morning? What does all of this scandal, what does this saga mean for This Morning? And what does it mean for ITV? They're losing lots of money, it seems.
Well, on a personal scale, I cannot believe how much coverage this has had. This has been leading bulletins across networks. It's acres and acres of newsprint for something that I think is of little interest to quite a lot of people. However, the wider context is about potential abuse of power within the media and a young person. And I think, there are lots and lots of grey areas here. I think it's being blown up into something of a national scandal, which I don't think it is, although I think some people might like it to be. But I think, there are questions about the toxicity in an organisation, whether it's ITV, whether it's the CBI, whether it's the House of Commons, whether it's any other organisation, and particularly with relation to young people and something that might be perceived as an abuse of somebody's power and influence on an impressionable young person. So I think, there are questions, but I don't think this necessarily affects ITV as a whole.
Do you think ITV will essentially get over this, recover
I'm sure
from
they
it?
will. I mean, they do good programmes and they make... And also, I think the other thing, Emily, is we all know the media is not like real life. I mean, I started off in newsrooms where people used to throw typewriters at you and you just learnt to duck.
Goodness me, well, I'm glad it's changed for the benefit of, not having injuries every day on a daily basis. Connor, your quick reaction to this story. What do you think the future of This Morning? Is this catastrophic? Will they never recover? I mean, advertisers are pulling their brands from the show. You've got contributors refusing to go on. You've got so much secrecy around the whole thing, things we don't know, etc., etc. Everyone has an opinion. What's yours?
I think the show is synonymous with Holly and Phil, therefore it's become a bit of a contaminated brand. You could see with the two hosts before, Alison Hammond, and the guy who presents X Factor. That's it. They look like they're in a hostage situation, trying to skirt around it. So it's toxic as a label. They're probably going to have to move the slate out with something else and a whole new look. And the reason I think it's such ubiquitous coverage is because it's not a national scandal yet, because I think people are holding their breath for if another penny drops. And we've had quite a few media scandals from very popular media heads and a conspiracy of silence in places like the BBC in recent years, and people are wondering if this is going to be something similar.
Yes, and people are, of course, asking whether there are double standards when it comes to the ITV's chief exec, of course. People like Piers Morgan, Jeremy Clarkson, heads have rolled for less, I would argue, for political reasons. So we shall see how that unfolds. Let us know what you think. There's been so much coverage of this. Perhaps you have strong views either way on the future of ITV's This Morning. But we're going to move on to a big political story. Who would have thought it? Record immigration has put pressure on housing. That's what new research says. It has increased demand for over 200,000 new rental properties, driven up rents by 8% in the past year alone. Of course, last week we heard from the Home Office. Data showed inward migration, 606,000 net over the last year. That was up from 500,000 the year before. So surely this is a statement of the obvious. The more people coming from overseas, the more pressure on housing, particularly at the lower end, and the higher the price of rent. Jo, that's just common sense, isn't it?
Well, there is a shortage of rental properties across the country, and the rents, particularly in London and the South East, are astronomical. It is obviously, if you have more people looking for rented property, there's going to be greater pressure on that part of the market. But the number of people moving to the UK on permanent working visas, 100,000 in the year to March this year, that's a 97%. So that's 4 times the pre-pandemic and pre-Brexit norm, and 171% surge in skilled workers in health and care. So that's an extra 64, nearly 65,000. So those visas account for more than half of all worker visas granted up until March. So, you know, we want people, we need people to come and fill those gaps, particularly in health and social care and other industries where there are visas are permitted and they're allowed. If you're coming on a short-term working visa, you probably are not going to be looking to buy a property. You are most likely going to be in a city rather than a rural area or a less urban area where the pressures are huge. I mean, there's also a whole load of other issues about housing, second homes that aren't now available for long-term rent, who go, you know, that are now
tiny
Airbnb.
proportion, though. I've seen analysis of that, and it really is a drop in the ocean. It's the numbers, basically. It's supply and demand, isn't it, really, Connor? Is it fair to say, if you take this at face value, this analysis, which I have no reason not to, is it fair to say that actually mass immigration is raising the cost of living for the rest of us?
Quite obviously. I'm so glad we finally discovered exactly, as the great Tom Harwood of GBNews once said, what happened in 1997 that caused house prices to skyrocket? And that was Tony Blair's mass immigration reform, which has been continued under the Conservatives to record numbers, despite in every single election, in every single manifesto, them promising to control and reduce immigration as the #1 issue on the ballot. Frankly, if you bring in a city the size of Liverpool in every year and now double that, because it's going to look to top possibly 1 million this year, of course there's going to be stress on infrastructure, housing and the NHS. And funnily enough, I think the reason we keep needing to bring in health and social care workers is, one, the disproportionate use at point of use without ever paying into the system that new immigrants use the NHS for versus long-term paying residents of the UK. And two, the reason we don't have a surplus of home-trained doctors and nurses is because in places like Australia or America, the incentives and pay are far better. And the reason the incentives and pay are far better is because they're more in demand, whereas we just have taken the strategy of let's import people from overseas who are more willing to accept lower wages. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I don't have the statistics on, I mean, I don't imagine you've brought them with you, but the statistics on whether new immigrants are using you know, the NHS more than those who have been living here for X amount of years. But of course, the longer you're here, the more you've paid in. So on day one of entering a country, obviously you haven't paid in for any of the public services yet. But do you think we have got, because Labour seem to agree with this is something that both the left and right of the political spectrum are talking about, getting those numbers down, unless they're just lying to us and they have no intention, which of course is possible. Do you think that we have an unsustainable economic model whereby we rely on constantly bringing in more and more migrants to fill those shortage gaps? Meanwhile, we have a record number of people not working.
Well, we have failed abysmally to prepare for Brexit, which any fool would have told you, would have seen a mass exodus of all the people who used to be here, people from Eastern Europe, people from Poland, who were doing a lot of jobs, who were coming over for a little while, working really hard and then going back. They were doing stuff and we sort of took it for granted. We've got an appalling record on apprenticeship schemes, despite umpteen government initiatives. I mean, there was figures out over the weekend that the dropout rate on the government's apprenticeship scheme is something like 90%. And if that was the same of pupils dropping out of A-levels, there would be an absolute outcry. So we're not training people to do the jobs that we need to do. There's no long-term industrial strategy. And yes, for too long, we've relied on other people to come and do jobs. And they're not just the jobs that other people don't want to do. These are skilled jobs, working in health and social care. But the wages are poor, the stress is ridiculous, working on farms.
I worry that this started, though, for ideological reasons. I think Conor is right. I think high levels immigration to this country started because ideologically Tony Blair's government liked the idea of being very liberal when it came to our borders, being very open when it came to our borders. And so we've been lazy in terms of improving our productivity. We've been lazy in terms of training up people in this country already and just become so reliant. I don't know how a government would now cut immigration to the tens of thousands, as David Cameron promised, how they'd even start to do that, because we're so reliant now.
One of the original quotes from a Blair advisor was, we wanted to open the borders to rub the right's nose in diversity, and then they have since said that that's backfired. And what's happened is if we have created an immigration system that was ideologically motivated to do that to the Conservative Party originally, the Conservative Party have now made that bug a feature of the British economy. So we've got a just-in-time economy and a just-in-time policy plan, so that they only plan for the next couple of years or the year-on-year GDP growth balance sheet. And that's why we don't have a long-term industrial strategy. That's why we're not investing in new farming equipment. We're paying low-wage fruit pickers instead, because if you just import more people, then the GDP looks kind of okay.
Yeah, it looks better on a balance sheet. I think a lot of people are seeing through that now and thinking, well, actually, on an individual basis, we're not better off. But taking it to, just linking this to another topic that was in the news, but it's related, is this new report from a think tank, Onward, who say that this is the first generation of young people who will never vote Conservative or who will never move further to the right. Lots of young people are concerned about housing, of course, and that is one of the reasons why they won't vote Tory. But also, they are very liberal when it comes to immigration. So why is that? Do they not link the two? Why do they not link the two?
Well, I think they don't link to the two for the exact same reasons, because the media hasn't really been talking about it for the last little while. I mean, even within the Conservative Party, it wasn't until the National Conservative Conference 2 years ago that we were talking about immigration's impact on housing and falling birth rates. And I think that's, and this is something we discussed last time we were on, Joe, that's one of the main reasons why millennials and Gen Z a little bit more than millennials, aren't moving rightward. It's because the majority of people, once they have a family, start voting for lower taxes, keeping more of what you earn, because you're less reliant on the state for provisions. And it's something like 27% of men 18 to 30 are unmarried virgins, and 50.1% of women in the UK have reached 30 without any children. And so you've got an entire generation with no, housebound investment in continuing the civilization. No wonder they keep voting for parties that are just going to promise them more money.
Yeah, I do think there's a lot of truth to that. Joe, just do you worry, because we always talk about net migration figures, and we don't talk about those who are emigrating. Do you worry that we're losing highly skilled people to potentially more advanced economies or countries that are better for entrepreneurial people, are more welcoming to that sort of person? I worry that we're losing high-skilled people and getting a lot of low-skilled in return.
Anecdotally, yes. We know that people are going to Australia, they're going to the States, going to New Zealand. I mean, what we always seem to forget in the conversations about immigration is, English and an English-speaking country is a very attractive place for people who don't speak any other language apart from English.
Sure.
But I do think this report
no English at all.
Sorry?
No English at all, increasingly. I mean, we haven't exactly made it a language requirement to speak the language of the country you're coming
from. But back to this...
Yes, not in a lot of places in this country. I was up in Boston for our migration special in Lincolnshire, and it was very clear that a lot of the migrants did not speak a word of English.
But it's a draw for people, nevertheless. And I think, you know, the problem is, and I think this Onward report is really interesting, and obviously you and Connor are a much better place to say whether it's true or not, because I am past that age group. But I think it is very significant that people, you know, they feel they haven't got a stake because they can't afford to rent, they can't afford to buy a house, they're reliant on the bank of mum and dad. Mum and dad are probably thinking, blimey, we've got to pay for granny and granddad and social care and all of those sort of things.
Yes, people in their 50s and 60s are having to pay both ways, helping their children and their
So there's all of
parents.
those sort of things. And the future, I think, is perhaps a bit grim, but I do think it's very interesting that younger people are much more liberal, much less concerned, and actually the Conservative, with a small c, voters are less concerned about the things that the right wing of the Conservative Party...
I think there's quite a lot of self-censorship, though, just anecdotally. But we're coming up. We have to stop there for that one. But coming up, reports say Labour want to block all oil and gas drilling in the North Sea. Isn't that exactly what the Just Stop Oilers are demanding?
First and foremost, I'm a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing. We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway...
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dewbs Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's the scandal that's rocked British television. Philip Schofield, one of Britain's biggest stars, brought down over lies, deceit and betrayal. Tonight, I sit down with Eamon Holmes as the former This Morning host reveals the truth about the man he shared the famous sofa with.
I think Philip is absolutely right about toxicity, but my friend, the toxicity is not with me, Dan Wootton, or anyone else. The toxicity is with you.
As Schofield hits back, Eamon tells me what really happened inside ITV. Schofield, the real story, exclusively on Dan Wootton Tonight from 9 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I am definitely going to be tuning into Schofield for the inside scoop from Eamon Holmes this evening on the Dan Wootton Show. So, this is Dewbs Co with me, Emily Carver. I am standing in for Michelle Dewberry this evening. Keeping me company still is Joe Phillips, political commentator, and of course Connor Tomlinson, who is a writer and podcast host. May I just say, Glad has said, how right is Connor? He is saying that we British think about immigration, what we British think about immigration. The other problem is the roads. Well, we have had so much development within 10 miles of our property, the roads are at sometimes gridlocked. Yes, there are infrastructure issues, water, roads, public transport, NHS, etc., etc. And it's not bigoted to point that out. I guess you could just blame it all on the government, but I think it would be hard for any government to deal with the numbers as they are. Bernard says, until we start becoming a manufacturing company and not an importer of products, the country, nothing will change. All the power will stay with the stock markets and banks. Labour have done nothing about this either when in power. I think there's a lot of people at home who are thinking, you know, they're the same thing. There's a Rizzler paper between the two parties. Anyway, moving on. In Labour news, Labour-related news, it turns out they're nicking their manifesto pledges from eco-zealots Just Stop Oil. Labour has confirmed plans to block all new development of oil and gas drilling in the North Sea if they're elected. That's exactly what Just Stop Oil are asking for. So, if Labour form the next government, the party has said it will also limit borrowing to green investment only. So Sir Keir Starmer is expected to make the announcement when he visits Scotland next month as part of his latest national mission. Now, I can't get my head around this one, Joe. Has Labour decided on this policy because they want to appeal to the eco-lobby and those concerned by environmental issues and climate change, or has it got something to do with the SNP?
Well, that's very cynical, Emily, but I think you're probably right on the last bit. Yes, interesting that he's going to make these remarks in Scotland next month, where the SNP have, you know, always said they want to see a stop, but fallen slightly short of being as strong as Starmer is allegedly going to be. Yes, the SNP is imploding since Nicola Sturgeon stood down, and those votes are up for grabs for Labour, I would have thought. So I think that is part of the thinking behind it. I mean, I think it's very bold. I think it's going to be an extremely hard sell, not just to the general public, but within the Labour Party. Already the GMB union have come out and said, we're not so sure about this. But I think, you know, you are either going to commit to green energy and an end to fossil fuel exploitation, or you're going to continue kicking it into the long grass again and again and again until we've run out of natural resources and we're not doing anything. But, you know, there are two big issues here. One is people will go, oh, well, then we're going to be reliant on Putin or whoever it is for gas and oil. Until we can get our own wind turbines.
Which is a pretty good point, I must say.
And the other question is, you know, do you want to say, having been, you know, Rachel Reeves is making a very good fist of being Shadow Chancellor and is, you know, giving Gordon Brown a run for his money on prudence, but, you know, are you actually going to say, yes, we're going to borrow for investment? Fine if it's green investment, but it's got to be hypothecated, it's got to be ring-fenced, because otherwise they're breaking their own rules.
Yes, that's a very good point. I mean, Connor, to me, this is madness. As Joe pointed out there, one of the key arguments against this is that, well, OK, we don't drill for oil and gas in this country anymore. So what do? We're going to be reliant on oil and gas in one way or another for the next couple of decades at least. So where are we going to get that oil and gas from?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, my background was in energy policy, and so I wrote a paper in 2021 forecasting what would happen if, funnily enough, there was problems with Russia, which there usually have been throughout history. Then we're kind of up creek without a paddle there, because one of our leading suppliers, well, Norway, obviously, who can actually tap the North Sea, so we just let them do that, whereas if we tapped about 10% of it, we'd have enough energy for the country for 50 years, so that would seem like a really sensible plan, but we decided not to do that. We also had imports from Qatar, and we had all of those problems, human rights-wise, recently with the World Cup, and we were importing from Russia. And then we can see with the Russians, a great example, what happens if you are an energy-independent country that then sabotages your own energy independence with America. So under Donald Trump, he decided to make America an energy-independent nation through fracking for the first time that President Nixon in the 60s had set the mandate. And he achieved it. He made America a net exporter. When the Saudis and the Russians tried holding them ransom with OPEC over the price of oil. Trump was actually at the negotiating table and badgered them down, and so it meant America had more standing in the global stage. And then during that time as well, he oversaw America being the leading nation in the world reducing emissions from 2017 to 2019. So it flew against all of the climate lobby's conventional wisdom. As soon as Biden gets in, on day one, he cancels his Keystone XL. Later on, by fiat, he makes it so that there are no federal gas leases no gas leases on federal land. He extends it indefinitely. And so because America's reduced its gas production, they start increasing imports from Russia, almost like clockwork.
Well, this is the thing. I do worry about our politicians virtue signalling on the domestic stage, using this to talk big at things like COP26 on the international stage. And meanwhile, we're having to import things from dodgy, nefarious regimes.
Well,
Joe, it's all
you see, again, this goes back to long-term strategy. Connor mentioned Norway. I mean, Norway had a long-term strategy for its wealth from oil. It's, put all of that investment, ring-fenced it, used it to create a very successful, prosperous country with fantastic, social facilities, social services, education, and all the rest of it. We've had 13 years of this government, but we've been talking about energy problems for 40, 50 years. We've had, I've been to umpteen conferences with, big oil producers where they were talking about peak oil, and we're pretty much reaching that point, and the need to invest in.
I don't know. I think there's quite a lot left to be drilled. Well, because I know people who work off in Scotland in the industry, off on the rigs, and they're not going to stop drilling if this happens, and if the windfall taxes, stop them investing in our country. They're just going to go elsewhere. No, but they'll just take their drills and go elsewhere. We're not going to stop climate change in this way. It's just virtual signaling.
How are we going to stop climate change?
Well, everything is moving in that direction. The market is providing solutions. I don't think governments know which ones are going to win out. So electric vehicles sounds great, but maybe we won't be driving electric vehicles in 20 years' time. We might be driving something completely different.
But that comes back to infrastructure and long-term planning. Are we building houses? Have we been building houses for the last 20, 30 years that are much more ecologically friendly, much more environmentally sound? No, we haven't. We're still dependent on boilers.
Long-term planning, Joe, that's a pipe dream.
Well, I know, but it's the only way you get anything done properly.
Les sounds like a realist. He says, we will depend on further imports for decades to come, whilst other countries of the world invest heavily in oil and gas. We will pay dearly for their foolish proposal. That's it. We'll lose out on all the tax money that comes from it. We'll lose out on all the jobs that come from it. Scotland's economy will be hit very, very hard indeed. Many people will lose their jobs, and we'll end up importing oil and gas anyway from halfway around the world, where it's probably more dirty. Yeah, but we should do that at the same time. I'm not against wind farms per se.
But all the time you've got the option. You're never going to make the tough decision. Say, right, we are really going to put our efforts into onshore, offshore
If
wind.
I can chime in on the Scottish point, because I actually went to Whitley Wind Farm, I asked them about this, and they said, we import them from Spain, we bring them over by shipping container, they don't make back the energy they needed, and so we actually need nuclear or gas to support it. So even the wind farm manufacturers don't want 100% renewable.
Well, there we go.
I can trump that with other wind farms that I've visited, but so,
let's see what people at home think about wind farms. Are they fantastic, ingenious piece of technology, or are they...
they don't bloody work.
or do they not work, as Connor says. Anyway, coming up, unsurprisingly, perhaps, supermarkets have come out in unison to slam the government's latest inflation-busting proposal to cap the prices of essentials. What are the Conservatives thinking?
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I have walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
So Dewbs Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views, and often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Welcome back to Dewbs Co with me, Emily Carver. So keeping me company this evening is Joe Phillips, political commentator, and Connor Tomlinson, who is a writer and podcast host. And I must say, according to my Twitter, if that's something to go by, you're getting quite a lot of love this evening. Lots of people are appreciating your common sense views of
Well, there's a first time for everything, isn't there?
I know. They must be mad. They must be mad.
That's
Joe.
all right. No, don't worry. It's fine. I'm used to being the pantomime villain on this show.
You are not. Never. Let's go to my inbox because we've got lots coming in on Labour's oil and gas policy potential. Kath says, just stop Labour. I think that's a play on just stop oil. Very good.
That'll be the Tories' new slogan, won't it?
Just stop Labour, yes. Richard said, just stop oil, need to get over this tantrum. We're going to need oil for many decades to come. Fact. Well, it's not just stop oil, it's also the Labour Party who want to do this. Ken says, why don't we keep North Sea oil and gas to ourselves and not sell it on the open market? I don't know if we're allowed to do that. I don't think we're allowed to. We have to sell it on the market. And Dee says, can you please explain what you do when the wind doesn't blow? What an idiot. Wind farms cost the British people very expensive, unreliable electricity. It is also heavily subsidised. I don't know who you're calling an idiot. Hopefully Keir Starmer and not me, or one of my lovely panellists. Anyway, moving swiftly on, the government's plans to ask supermarkets to voluntarily cap the price of basic food items like bread and milk have been unsurprisingly met with widespread derision pretty much across the board. The British Retail Consortium has said the measures would not make a jot of difference and that the government should focus on keeping prices as low as possible rather than recreating 1970s style price controls. So, we know we've got a ridiculously high level of inflation, Joe, when it comes to food. Is this too little, too late? Is it an absolutely absurd policy proposal? Why are the Conservatives doing this? It seems like they're trying to pinch policies from the left because they've run out of ideas.
Well, they've certainly run out of ideas, and they're certainly clutching at any straw that it happens to be the current concern of people without stopping to think again, as I've said before, about any long-term, sensible, strategic planning. You know, what have they done to prepare post-Brexit for what's happened in the farming industry? The lack of people to pick and sort through. You know, we've got a huge shortage of butchers. We've got a problem with a shortage of vets. We've got a problem with people picking crops and packaging and all of those sort of things, which used to be very, very conveniently filled by many, many Eastern European workers who'd come over on temporary visas, they'd work for 3 months through the summer, and then they'd go home again. All of that's gone. The government has made no effort whatsoever to look at what's happening. Now, there have been obvious things like Ukraine war, which has had a huge impact on wheat supplies and therefore the cost of it, and also on the cost and impact on fertiliser, very important for farms. And the supermarkets are making massive profits, we know. But they're not going to go for price caps. France has done this as a voluntary thing for 3 months only as a trial. And I think
France always does mad things, and then they backtrack on them immediately. With the various wealth taxes and things like that.
But I do think, we really have to have a bigger conversation. Yes, the price of food is absolutely astronomical, and it's really, really frightening for many, many people. But we've had cheap stuff for a very long time without giving any thought as to how it gets to be cheap. Where does it come from? Why does it chicken only cost threepence halfpenny?
I'm going to pick you up because I've let you have your say there. And you've made some very good points, of course, as you always do. But you've mentioned Brexit several times. I just want to pick you up and get Connor's view on that, because has this got anything really to do with Brexit? Because we've seen food inflation reaching record high levels in many European countries.
Yeah, Germany's just about to enter a recession as well, and as far as I know, they didn't withdraw from the European Union. One thing that you omitted in your analysis there, Joe, all of those factors definitely contributed to it. No mention of lockdown. Yes. And 33% of all pounds in existence were printed in those 2 years. It took some time to go...
Now, that is a great stat.
There you go.
I'll have to fact-check that.
There was a significant amount of dollars as well. And that's the global reserve currency, so obviously it's making everything way more expensive. So the point is, now that's worked through the system, of course that's going to make skyrocketing inflation. And the reason they're talking about price controls and making them voluntary as well, so the government isn't on the hook for making it a mandatory policy, because we all know anytime you put a price cap on overnight, when the price raises, it hits people hardest. The reason they want to do this is to make a smokescreen away from the Bank of England, the Treasury, and the sitting Prime Minister, who was the Chancellor, who have basically screwed up the economy with their policy.
But why is inflation so sticky in this country? Why is it lasting so long, in particular on food? Any ideas?
Well, one, it's because we don't produce nearly as much of our food as America, for example. There's a great comparison.
So we need to be more self-sufficient.
Absolutely, and I agree with you in terms of the farming regulations. It's not just the post-Brexit subsidies that they screwed up and didn't realise what to do, but as far as I'm concerned, anyone who's watched Clarkson's Farm would say defra delenda est. They're more interested in shooting innocent alpacas than getting rid of loads of the bureaucracy that is weighing down British farmers. And we've been paying them to retire. Why on earth are we doing that, rather than making sure that they can buy new machinery to deliver us nice food?
Well, there you go. There's a lot there, Joe. Price caps. Why do you think the government is even considering these type of measures? Is it desperation so that they can say the price of milk is staying at, £1 or whatever for the next 2 months and onwards?
It is desperation to be seen to be doing something. And I think that what is probably needling Rishi Sunak quite a lot is continual polling that shows that although people prefer him in many, many ways to his predecessors, and they, in some cases, they prefer him to his Conservative Party, there is this huge disconnect because he is so fabulously wealthy, so unimaginably wealthy.
I think he comes across as quite humble, though. I disagree with him on all sorts, but I don't think he comes across as this sort of...
But I do think there is that sense of, you do something desperate when you suddenly come up against somebody who says, look, I'm a nurse or I'm a teacher, I'm earning average salary and I'm still having to go to a food bank.
Panic, because he can't relate and he can't speak to people as if they're normal people. That is a problem for a lot of our politicians. David just says very quickly, a voluntary price cap is an oxymoron. Alan says government control of prices was tried in the Soviet Union for years and queues went round the block just to get some bread. So there you go, slammed again. It seems everyone is slamming this potential policy, so the government probably won't go ahead with it, but who knows? They are sometimes mad. Coming up, as the Met Police announce they'll no longer respond to mental health call-outs, we're asking, is it a dereliction of duty?
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
It's the scandal that's rocked British television. Philip Schofield, one of Britain's biggest stars, brought down over lies, deceit and betrayal. Tonight, I sit down with Eamon Holmes as the former This Morning host reveals the truth about the man he shared the famous sofa with.
I think Philip is absolutely right about toxicity. But my friend, the toxicity is not with me, Dan Wootton, or anyone else. The toxicity is with you.
As Schofield hits back, Eamon tells me what really happened inside ITV. Schofield, the real story, exclusively on Dan Wootton tonight from 9 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to Dewbs Co with me, Emily Carver. So keeping me company until 7 is Joe Phillips, political commentator, and Connor Tomlinson, who is a writer and podcast host, and who has just informed me that he eats a protein-only diet. Steak for breakfast, lunch and dinner. Is that right, Connor?
Mainly dinner, yeah. Protein shakes in the morning and for lunch.
Well, there you go. That must be where his common sense views come from.
Protein shakes. No, you've got to eat proper food.
Makes me feel all right. I'm quite
He looks all right, doesn't he?
No, he looks rather tired.
He looks tight when he's been out on the
rough weekend.
out on the lash.
I
heard a rough weekend.
Well, I don't think he's going to be with Patrick at the male stripper thing unless he
No, the dreamer.
Sleep.
We've only got 4 or 5 minutes left of the show, unfortunately, so we're going to go straight into our next, our last subject, the Met Police. But first, actually, I've just been told that we've got a lovely message about a certain panellist, Joe. For balance, Richard says, can I just say that Jo is and always will be the best panellist on Dewbs Co, and that's coming from someone that disagrees with most of what she says.
Well, how very kind. Thank you, Richard.
That is
How
quite
lovely.
funny. That is quite funny, and I must say, my mum also likes Jo the best.
Well, and I love your mum.
I'm joking. So, from September, the Met Police have announced they will no longer attend mental health call-outs unless there is an immediate threat to life. They believe it will free up officers who spend an estimated 20 to 40% of their time dealing with such incidents. The Met Police Commissioner Mark Rowley said both patients and the public were being failed because of the lack of appropriate help. Nationwide has been reported that 30,000 muggings went unsolved last year. So, Connor, we've got the police saying that they no longer want to be called or no longer want to go out when they're called for mental health incidents. I think that that is a dereliction of duty, because mental health incidents, when there are people who are clearly mentally unwell, they can act in very... unpredictable ways, and you don't know if there's going to be an immediate threat to life.
Yeah, you're going to have to rely on sort of witness testimony down the phone, which could actually downplay the severity of the situation. And this is both to other people, of course, if they're unstable and they're endangering other people, or themselves, because a lot of the time, if you just send a social worker out to chat to someone, you do need to forcibly subdue people who are going through a psychotic episode and might be trying to harm themselves for their own good. And so I just sort of question, I understand this might be an issue of resource allocation, but again, they're not going after burglaries. They've been increasingly enforcing public order acts for people who have said offensive things outdoors or online. It just seems that it's going in the wrong direction as to the issues that actually face people. And it's weird that pretty much every single police reform seems pro-criminal or pro-public disorder. I mean, we're seeing the same thing in America now, of where with Jordan Neely on the train, for example, in New York, the man who subdued the mentally ill man who had an arrest record has now been arrested. So it's a lot of the time it feels like law-abiding citizens or people that are just trying to help people who are going through something, they're the ones being criminalised.
So you think the law protects the perpetrator more than it protects the victim sometimes?
Yeah.
The balance isn't right. I think you make an interesting point there. I've heard the same, particularly when it comes to the States, over in the States. Jo, to give another view, Lee has written in, he says, as a paramedic, like the police, we spend most of our time having to deal with mental health call-outs and waste a good deal of our evenings talking through issues with those who have no medical need at all because there's no other service to deal with them. So there, we do have some sympathy with that.
And my son's a paramedic, and that's exactly what I would have said. And all that's going to happen is that the police are going to funnel the problem to somebody else. But what you have to remember is that only the police have the right, legally, to take someone to a place of safety. Paramedics can't do that. If somebody refuses to go in an ambulance, you can't make somebody go in an ambulance. And the idea that there would be a social worker available, I mean, there aren't social workers available to go and see people in their own homes, to look after children or old people or people with learning difficulties. You know, this is ridiculous. This is just pushing the problem somewhere else.
Do you know what? Just from this past hour with you two, it seems the theme that seems to run through everything is shortage. We are shortage Britain. Great shortage Britain is what we are at the moment. We don't have enough of anything, it seems. Let's just go to Angela very quickly. She says the police are not social workers or mental health professionals. Crime is through the roof. They need to concentrate on that. Well, the 30,000 muggings that went unsolved last year shows us that is the case, as well as people stealing cars. All of these smaller but very important crimes, very devastating crimes for individuals, for victims, are going unsolved, unnoticed. Gavin says the Mental Health Act always stated that the primary agency responsible for dealing with mental health was the NHS. The problem was they didn't, so the police had to pick up the pieces. Well, there you go. People seem to be sympathetic with the police and the fact that they have so much to do and they can't be dealing with people with mental health problems on top of everything else. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you both. Thank you very much indeed, Connor Tomlinson and Jo Phillips with me. Thank you very much indeed. I very much enjoyed that. Michelle will be back tomorrow, of course, and Nigel Farage is coming up at the top of the hour, so stay tuned.
Good evening, my name's Rachel Ayres and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast brought to you by the Met Office. So this bank holiday Monday has been pretty settled, and that's not going to change as we go through tonight or the next couple of days, with this area of high pressure still remaining centred to the northwest of the UK as we go into the end of May. But it does mean that we have got these brisk